My name is Beverly, and I'm 32 years old. I never thought sitting in a lawyer's office on a crisp October morning in 2023 would change everything I believed about my family. The mahogany walls seemed to close in as I waited for my grandfather's will to be read, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. Grandpa William had always been different from my parents, the only one who truly saw me for who I was rather than who I wasn't. Growing up, I'd felt the sting of being the overlooked daughter, watching my younger sister Stephanie bask in our parents' endless praise, while I struggled for even a moment of their attention. But Grandpa was different. He'd take me fishing, teach me about hard work, and tell me stories about building character rather than just building wealth. As I sat there that morning, I hoped maybe, just maybe, he'd left me something meaningful that would show I mattered to someone in this family. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and please hit that like button and subscribe for more family drama stories that will shock you to your core. Let me take you back to understand how we got to this moment. I grew up in a mansion in Connecticut where money flowed like water and appearances mattered more than authenticity. My father, Harold, now 65, had built a real estate empire that made him one of the wealthiest men in our county. He was the type of man who measured success only in dollars and social status. My mother, Patricia, 62, was a former Miss Connecticut who spent her days organizing charity galas and maintaining her position as president of the most exclusive women's club in town. To them, life was about keeping up the perfect facade. Then there was my sister Stephanie, 28 years old, and everything my parents had ever dreamed of in a daughter. She'd just graduated from Harvard Business School with honors and was already being groomed to take over significant portions of Dad's business empire. Stephanie had inherited our mother's beauty and our father's ruthless ambition. She lived in the penthouse apartment Dad bought her in downtown Hartford, drove a brand new BMW, and wore designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salary. I, on the other hand, had chosen a completely different path. After graduating from the University of Connecticut, with a degree in elementary education, I'd become a third-grade teacher at a public school in a working-class neighborhood. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment, drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic, and shopped at Target instead of Nordstrom. My parents viewed my career choice as a personal embarrassment, often introducing me to their friends as their daughter, who chose to work with children, in a tone that suggested I had some kind of mental deficiency. But Grandpa William understood me. He was 87 when he passed away just 3 weeks before this will reading, and he'd spent my entire life being the one bright spot in my family relationships. While my parents criticized my life choices, Grandpa would sit with me on his back porch, teaching me how to tie fishing lines and telling me stories about his own humble beginnings. He'd grown up poor during the Great Depression and had worked his way up from nothing to build the family fortune that my father had inherited and expanded. Grandpa always said that true wealth wasn't about money, but about character, integrity, and the ability to sleep peacefully at night, knowing you'd lived honorably. He'd watched Stephanie's shopping sprees and expensive lifestyle with a quiet disapproval that he never voiced aloud, but I could see it in his eyes. He worried that she was becoming everything wrong with privileged society. Meanwhile, he'd praise my dedication to teaching my independence and my refusal to take handouts from the family fortune. During my childhood, the contrast in treatment was painfully obvious. Stephanie's bedroom was redecorated every 2 years with whatever theme struck her fancy, while mine remained the same pale yellow for over a decade. She got a new car for her 16th birthday, while I was told that if I wanted a car, I could get a job and save up for one myself. Family vacations were planned around Stephanie's interests and schedule, while my preferences were rarely considered. The most painful part wasn't even the material differences, but the emotional neglect. When Stephanie won a school debate competition, my parents threw a celebration dinner at the country club. When I was named Teacher of the Year at my school last spring, they sent a congratulatory text message and never mentioned it again. It was as if I existed in their world, but wasn't truly part of their lives. Grandpa saw all of this, and it broke his heart. He'd often pull me aside during family gatherings to tell me how proud he was of the woman I'd become. He'd say that while Stephanie might have inherited the family looks and charm, I'd inherited something far more valuable, the family values that had been lost somewhere along the way. These conversations with Grandpa were the only thing that kept me coming to family events at all. The morning of the will reading arrived gray and overcast, matching my mood perfectly. I'd barely slept the night before, partly from grief over losing the one family member who truly loved me, and partly from anxiety about what would happen in that lawyer's office. Thompson and Associates occupied the top floor of one of Hartford's most prestigious buildings, and their conference room overlooked the Connecticut River through floor-to-ceiling windows. I arrived 15 minutes early, hoping to have a moment to collect myself before facing my family. The receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her 50s, offered me coffee and directed me to the leather chairs in the waiting area. The office smelled of expensive wood polish and old money, with oil paintings of distinguished-looking men lining the walls and Persian rugs covering gleaming hardwood floors. My parents arrived exactly on time, as they always did for important business matters. Dad wore his best charcoal gray suit, the one he reserved for board meetings and significant financial discussions. Mom had chosen a black Chanel dress that probably cost more than I made in a month, paired with pearl earrings that had been in her family for generations. They nodded at me politely, but didn't sit near me, instead choosing chairs on the opposite side of the waiting area. Stephanie made her entrance 10 minutes later, and as always, she commanded attention the moment she walked through the door. She wore a navy blue Armani suit that hugged her perfectly toned figure, paired with Louboutin heels that clicked authoritatively against the marble floor. Her blonde hair was styled in an elegant chignon, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. She air-kissed our parents and gave me a brief condescending smile before settling into the chair furthest from mine. The family dynamic was immediately apparent to anyone watching. Mom and Dad flanked Stephanie like bodyguards, engaging her in quiet conversation about her recent presentation to potential investors. They discussed her ideas for expanding the company's commercial real estate portfolio, her thoughts on the current market trends, and her plans for the future. I sat alone, checking my phone and trying to look like I belonged in this world of power suits and financial discussions. Martin Thompson emerged from his office precisely at 9 o'clock, looking every inch the successful attorney he'd built his reputation to be. He was a man in his mid-50s, with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of confident bearing that comes from decades of handling high-stakes legal matters. He'd been Grandpa's friend for over 30 years, having started as a junior associate at the firm when Grandpa first hired them to handle his business affairs. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. Thompson said, his voice carrying the gravitas befitting the occasion. "Thank you all for being here. I know this is a difficult time, but William was very specific about his wishes, and I'll do my best to honor his memory by carrying out his instructions exactly as he intended." We filed into the conference room, and I noticed how naturally my family arranged themselves. Dad took the seat at the head of the table, even though this wasn't his meeting. Mom sat to his right, and Stephanie took the chair beside her. I was left to sit across from them, feeling like I was facing a tribunal rather than attending a family gathering. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, and I suspected it wasn't accidental either. Mr. Thompson spread several documents across the polished conference table and cleared his throat. "William's estate is valued at approximately $7 million, he began, and I saw Stephanie's eyes light up with barely concealed excitement. "This includes his investment portfolio, real estate holdings, personal property, and various financial accounts he maintained." The tension in the room was palpable. Dad leaned forward slightly, his businessman instincts kicking in as he mentally calculated numbers. Mom smoothed her dress and sat up straighter, as if preparing to receive good news. Stephanie actually smiled, no doubt already planning how she'd spend her inheritance. And me, I just hoped I'd receive something, anything that would prove I'd mattered to the one person in this family who'd ever truly loved me. Mr. Thompson adjusted his glasses and began reading from the official document, his voice steady and professional, despite the emotional weight of the moment. "I'll begin with the smaller bequests and personal items before we move to the major financial distributions," he announced, and I felt my stomach clench with anticipation. To my daughter-in-law, Patricia, I leave my late wife's jewelry collection and her china set with the hope that these family heirlooms will be treasured and passed down through generations. Mom nodded graciously, though I could tell she was impatient to get to the important part. To my son Harold, I leave my collection of first edition books and my grandfather's pocket watch symbols of the family history and wisdom I hope he'll continue to honor. Dad accepted this with a brief nod, clearly focused on bigger prizes ahead. To my granddaughter Beverly, I leave my fishing tackle box, my collection of handwritten letters from your grandmother, and my leather-bound journal containing 30 years of daily reflections. My heart swelled at these personal items, knowing how much time Grandpa had spent with that tackle box during our fishing trips and how precious those letters were to him. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Mr. Thompson's expression grew more serious as he reached the financial portion of the will. Regarding the monetary assets of the estate, he began, and the room fell completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. To my granddaughter Stephanie, who has shown exceptional business acumen and will undoubtedly continue the family's financial success, I leave the sum of $6,900,000 to be distributed through a trust fund with quarterly disbursements beginning on her 30th birthday. Stephanie's face broke into a radiant smile and she actually clasped her hands together in delight. Mom reached over and squeezed her arm proudly, while Dad nodded approvingly, as if he'd known this was coming all along. $6.9 million. The number echoed in my head as I watched my sister practically glowing with triumph. To my son Harold and daughter-in-law Patricia, I leave the family estate in Litchfield County valued at approximately $1.8 million, along with the remaining investment accounts and bonds ensuring your comfortable retirement. My parents exchanged satisfied glances, clearly pleased with their substantial inheritance. Dad was already probably calculating the property taxes and planning potential improvements to the estate. Then Mr. Thompson turned to me and something strange flickered across his face, an expression I couldn't quite read. And to my granddaughter Beverly, he said, his voice seeming to carry an odd weight, I leave the sum of $1 along with a wooden box containing personal items stored in my bedroom closet. The silence that followed was deafening. $1, not 1,000, not 100, one single dollar. The laughter started low, a chuckle from Dad, that grew into something more cruel. Mom joined in, her refined composure cracking to reveal something ugly underneath. Well, she said, her voice dripping with vindication, I suppose your grandfather finally saw what we've always known, Beverly. Some kids just don't measure up. Dad leaned back in his chair, looking more satisfied than I'd ever seen him. Maybe this will finally teach you that your bleeding heart lifestyle and your little teaching job aren't impressive to anyone who matters, he said, his words cutting through me like ice. Time to grow up and learn how the real world works. Stephanie tried to look sympathetic, but I could see the smugness behind her concerned expression. Oh, Beverly, I'm so sorry, she said in a voice that was anything but sorry. But hey, maybe Grandpa thought you were already so independent that you didn't need his help. You're always talking about making it on your own, right? Mom's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Your grandfather always was a practical man, she said. He probably figured that since you've chosen such a modest lifestyle, you wouldn't know what to do with real money anyway. Go earn your own like everyone else has to. I sat there stunned, feeling like I'd been slapped repeatedly. $1. After 32 years of being the overlooked daughter, after believing that at least Grandpa saw my worth, I'd been left with pocket change while my spoiled sister inherited nearly $7 million. The betrayal cut deeper than any treatment I'd received from my parents because I'd trusted Grandpa. I'd believed he was different. Mr. Thompson looked uncomfortable with my family's reaction, but he continued reading. Beverly, your grandfather's box is currently in my office safe. You can collect it at your convenience. His tone was professional, but I thought I detected a hint of something else, almost like he was trying to tell me something without saying it outright. I stood up on shaking legs, my face burning with humiliation and my heart breaking into pieces. Congratulations, Stephanie, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Enjoy your millions. As I walked toward the door, I heard Mom say to Stephanie, Well, darling, I think we should celebrate. Lunch at the country club. Their laughter followed me out of the conference room and into the hallway where I finally allowed the tears I'd been holding back to fall freely. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. The radio was playing some cheerful pop song that felt like mockery given my current state of mind. I'd never felt so completely alone in my entire life. The one person I'd believed truly loved and understood me had apparently seen me the same way my parents did, as the disappointing daughter who wasn't worth investing in. My apartment had never felt smaller or more pathetic than it did that afternoon. The contrast between my modest living space and the luxury my family took for granted felt crushing. My secondhand furniture, my small kitchen with its outdated appliances, my single bedroom with clothes hanging in a tiny closet, everything seemed to mock my naive belief that I was living a meaningful life. I called in sick to work something I'd never done unless I was actually ill. But how could I stand in front of my third graders and pretend everything was normal when my entire world had just shifted on its axis? How could I teach them about fairness and kindness when my own family had just demonstrated the opposite? For hours I sat on my couch staring at the wall, replaying every moment of the will reading. The way my parents had laughed. The satisfaction in Stephanie's eyes. The casual cruelty of their words. Some kids just don't measure up. The phrase kept echoing in my head like a broken record. But eventually, curiosity got the better of my self-pity. That wooden box Mr. Thompson had mentioned, what could possibly be in it that was worth leaving to me along with a single dollar? Maybe it contained more family photos or some of Grandpa's old tools. Maybe there was a letter explaining his decision, though I wasn't sure I wanted to read his reasoning for essentially disowning me. I called Mr. Thompson's office and arranged to pick up the box that evening. His secretary said he'd wait for me after normal business hours, which struck me as unusually accommodating for such a busy attorney. When I arrived at 6:30, the building was mostly empty except for security guards and a few late-working lawyers. Mr. Thompson met me at his office door personally, which also seemed strange. He handed me a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, made of dark walnut with brass hinges, that had developed a green patina with age. It was heavier than I expected, and I could hear things shifting inside when I moved it. "Beverly," Mr. Thompson said quietly, glancing around as if checking to make sure we were alone. "Your grandfather was very specific about this box. He said you should open it privately in your own home, and that you should read everything inside very carefully." There was something in his tone that made me look at him more closely. His expression was serious, almost grave, and he seemed to be trying to communicate something without saying it directly. "Is there something else I should know?" I asked, but he just shook his head. "Just follow your grandfather's instructions," he said. "Read everything carefully." I drove home with the box, sitting on my passenger seat, my mind racing with possibilities. Back in my apartment, I set it on my kitchen table and stared at it for several minutes before working up the courage to open it. The brass hinges creaked as I lifted the lid, and the first thing I saw was a stack of old photographs held together with a rubber band. Underneath were some official-looking documents, a few small personal items, and at the very bottom, a thick envelope with my name written across it in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. I started with the photographs, expecting to find family pictures or memories from his childhood. But what I found made my blood run cold. They were photos of documents, financial records, bank statements, and what appeared to be legal paperwork. I couldn't make sense of most of it, but I could see my father's name appearing frequently. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and unfolded several pages of Grandpa's careful handwriting. The letter was dated just 2 months before his death, and it began with words that made my heart stop. "My dearest Beverly, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and my final plan is in motion. I'm so sorry for what you must have endured today in that lawyer's office. but I need you to understand that everything was carefully orchestrated to protect you and to ensure justice is finally served. I had to read that first paragraph 3 times before it sank in. Grandpa's final plan. What did that mean? With shaking hands, I continued reading, and each word revealed a truth more shocking than the last. Beverly, for the past 5 years, I've been investigating irregularities in our family's financial records. What I discovered has broken my heart, but strengthened my resolve to make things right before I leave this world. Your father, Harold, has been embezzling money from the family trust funds, specifically from the inheritance that was meant to come to you and Stephanie from your grandmother's side of the family. I had to stop reading and pour myself a glass of water, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the letter. Embezzling Dad. The man who preached about business ethics and proper financial management had been stealing from his own family. The letter continued with devastating detail. When your maternal grandmother passed away 10 years ago, she left a trust fund of $3 million to be split equally between you and Stephanie when you each turned 30. Harold, as the executor of that trust, was supposed to manage those funds responsibly. Instead, he's been systematically draining your portion to cover his own business losses and to fund Stephanie's extravagant lifestyle. I felt sick to my stomach as the implications hit me. Not only had Dad stolen my inheritance, but he'd been using it to spoil Stephanie even more while making me feel guilty for not being as successful as my sister. The photos in the box suddenly made sense. They were evidence of Dad's crimes. The documents in this box prove that Harold has taken approximately $2,800,000 from your trust over the past decade. I've had private investigators and forensic accountants working on this case, and everything is documented and ready for legal action. But Beverly, I needed to be strategic about how to handle this. Grandpa's letter went on to explain the brilliance of his plan. If I had exposed Harold's crimes while I was alive, he would have had time to cover his tracks, move money offshore, or declare bankruptcy to avoid paying restitution. He also would have turned your mother and sister against you, claiming you were trying to destroy the family for money. So I devised a different approach. I was crying now, but they were tears of amazement rather than sadness. Grandpa had been protecting me all along, even when I thought he'd abandoned me. By making it appear that I was disappointed in you and leaving you only $1, I've accomplished several things. First, Harold and Patricia will let their guard down, believing they've won completely. Second, Stephanie will start spending her inheritance, immediately making it harder for the family to hide assets when the truth comes out. And third, you'll have the element of surprise when you strike back. The next part of the letter contained specific instructions that made my head spin. Beverly, you are not poor. In fact, you're about to become considerably wealthy, but through justice rather than charity. I've been secretly setting aside money in accounts that Harold doesn't know about. There's currently $4 million in a trust fund that I've established specifically for you, completely separate from the family estate that was read today. $4 million. I had to read that line 5 times to believe it. But the letter wasn't finished shocking me. More importantly, the evidence in this box will allow you to sue Harold for the money he's stolen from you, plus interest and penalties. Conservatively, you should be able to recover at least $5 million through the legal system. My attorney, Robert Sterling, has been secretly preparing this case for 2 years. His contact information is at the bottom of this letter. I found the business card for Sterling & Associates paper clipped to the final page of the letter. But Grandpa wasn't done explaining his master plan. The beauty of this approach, my dear granddaughter, is that Harold has been so confident in his schemes that he never imagined anyone was watching him. He's continued stealing right up until my death, which means the evidence is overwhelming and recent. When you present this case to the authorities, he won't be able to claim these were old mistakes or misunderstandings. The final paragraph of the letter made me laugh through my tears, a sound that probably would have seemed hysterical to anyone listening. Beverly, I've watched you become a woman of integrity and character, despite being raised in a family that values neither. You've chosen a career that helps children rather than one that simply makes money. You've lived within your means and worked hard for everything you have. You've remained kind and generous, even when your family treated you poorly. You are everything I hoped you would become, and you deserve not just my love, but also my respect and my estate. The $1 I left you in the official will represents the one thing your parents and sister can never take from you, your dignity. Everything else they've stolen or tried to destroy, but that remains yours. Now go take back what belongs to you, and remember that the greatest revenge is living well. The letter was signed, "With all my love and admiration, Grandpa William," and below his signature was a postscript that made me smile through my tears. P.S. I can't wait to see Patricia's face when she realizes how badly she underestimated you. I sat at my kitchen table for over an hour, reading and rereading the letter, examining the financial documents, and trying to process the magnitude of what Grandpa had uncovered. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements showing transfers from my trust fund to Dad's personal accounts. Receipts for Stephanie's credit card bills being paid from money that should have been mine. Investment records showing how Dad had used my inheritance as collateral for his own business deals. But more than the money, more than the vindication, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that I was loved. Grandpa hadn't abandoned me. He'd been planning the most elaborate gift of love and justice imaginable. He'd spent his final years not just protecting me, but positioning me to win a war I didn't even know was being fought. Tomorrow, I would call Robert Sterling and begin the process of getting my life back. But tonight, I would plan exactly how I wanted to confront my family and deliver the justice Grandpa had made possible. The next morning, I called in sick to work again and drove directly to the offices of Sterling and Associates. Unlike Thompson's traditional firm, this office had a modern, aggressive feel that seemed designed for battle rather than genteel estate planning. Robert Sterling was a man in his early 50s with the kind of sharp, intense energy that suggested he specialized in cases where someone needed to be held accountable. "Beverly," he said, standing to shake my hand when his secretary ushered me into his corner office. "I've been expecting your call. Your grandfather was one of the most thorough and determined clients I've ever worked with. He spent 2 years making sure we had an airtight case against your father." Sterling's desk was covered with file folders, each one labeled with different aspects of Dad's embezzlement scheme. There were folders for bank records, investment accounts, credit card statements, and even receipts for luxury items that Stephanie had purchased with money that legally belonged to me. "The evidence your grandfather collected is extraordinary," Sterling continued, opening the thickest folder. "We have documented proof that Harold has stolen exactly $2,860,000 from your trust fund over the past 10 years. We also have evidence that he's been falsifying documents to cover his tracks and that he's used your money as collateral for risky business investments." I listened in amazement as Sterling outlined the scope of Dad's crimes. It wasn't just simple theft. It was a complex scheme involving multiple accounts, fake documentation, and years of careful planning. Dad had been so confident that no one was watching him that he'd kept detailed records of everything, apparently for his own tax purposes. "The good news," Sterling said, "is that because Harold continued stealing right up until your grandfather's death, we can pursue criminal charges as well as civil restitution. The statute of limitations hasn't expired on any of his recent crimes, and the pattern of behavior shows this wasn't a mistake, but a deliberate, ongoing scheme." We spent 3 hours going through every piece of evidence and planning our legal strategy. Sterling explained that we could file both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit simultaneously. The criminal charges would likely result in jail time for Dad, while the civil suit would force him to pay back everything he'd stolen, plus interest and penalties. "Conservatively," Sterling said, "you should recover at least $5 million through the civil suit alone. And if we can prove that your father used your money for high-risk investments that paid off, we might be able to claim a percentage of those profits as well." But Sterling saved the best news for last. "Your grandfather also established a completely separate trust fund for you that your father never knew about. That account currently contains $4,200,000, and it's been earning interest for the past 5 years. That money is yours immediately, regardless of what happens with the lawsuit." I walked out of Sterling's office feeling like I was living in someone else's life. In less than 24 hours, I'd gone from being the family disappointment who inherited $1 to being a millionaire with the power to bring down the father who'd stolen from me for a decade. But Sterling had given me one crucial piece of advice: don't let your family know what's coming. The element of surprise is our biggest advantage. Let them think they've won while we prepare our attack. So I went back to my normal routine. I returned to work, taught my third graders graded papers, and lived my modest life while Sterling's team prepared the legal documents that would change everything. It was the hardest week of my life, pretending everything was normal while sitting on the biggest secret imaginable. The only difference was that I started paying attention to my family's social media posts and hearing their plans through mutual acquaintances. Stephanie had already started shopping for a new apartment in Manhattan, posting photos of luxury condos and designer furniture on Instagram. Mom was planning an extended European vacation to celebrate their good fortune. Dad was talking about expanding his business empire and buying a vacation home in the Hamptons. They were spending money they'd essentially stolen from me to celebrate their victory over me. The irony was almost too perfect. Sterling called me exactly 1 week after our first meeting. "Everything is ready," he said. "We'll be filing criminal charges against your father tomorrow morning, and the civil lawsuit will be filed simultaneously. The police will probably arrest him at his office, and all family assets will be frozen immediately pending the investigation." "What about timing?" I asked. "When should I tell them what's happening?" Sterling laughed, a sound that held no humor but a lot of satisfaction. "You don't tell them anything. Let them find out the hard way. But if you want to be there when it all comes crashing down, I suggest you arrange to visit them tomorrow evening. The arrest will happen around noon, so by dinner time, they'll be in full panic mode." I thought about that suggestion all night. Did I want to be there to see their faces when they realized how completely they'd underestimated me? Did I want to witness their shock and horror when they understood that their years of cruelty and theft were finally catching up with them? Yes. Yes, I absolutely did. I waited until 5 o'clock the next evening before driving to my parents' house, giving the legal system enough time to work its magic. Sterling had texted me at 1:15 to confirm that Dad had been arrested at his office and charged with embezzlement, fraud, and grand larceny. The story had already hit the local news by 3 o'clock, and I'd seen the headline on my phone: "Prominent real estate developer arrested for embezzling family trust funds." The family estate sat on 5 acres of perfectly manicured land in the most exclusive neighborhood in town. As I pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed Stephanie's BMW was there, along with several other cars I didn't recognize. Through the large windows, I could see people moving around inside, and the energy seemed frantic even from outside. I rang the doorbell and waited, my heart pounding with anticipation and adrenaline. Mom answered the door, and I was shocked by her appearance. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled. Her makeup was smeared from crying, and she looked like she'd aged 5 years in the past week. "Beverly," she said, her voice cracking with surprise and confusion. "What are you doing here?" "I heard about Dad on the news," I said, managing to sound concerned rather than triumphant. I wanted to make sure everyone was okay. She let me in, and I could immediately see that the house was in chaos. Papers were scattered across every surface, multiple phones were ringing constantly, and I could hear Stephanie crying hysterically in the living room. Several men in expensive suits were huddled around the dining room table with laptops and legal documents, clearly trying to manage the crisis. "Beverly," Stephanie sobbed when she saw me rushing over to grab my arm. "This is all some terrible mistake. Dad would never steal money from anyone, especially not from family. Someone's trying to frame him, and we need to figure out who." I looked around the room at the chaos, taking in every detail of their panic and confusion. "What exactly is happening?" I asked, still playing the role of concerned daughter and sister. Mom collapsed into her favorite armchair, looking defeated. "The police arrested your father this afternoon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They're claiming he stole money from some family trust fund that I didn't even know existed. They say he took nearly $3 million over 10 years. One of the lawyers looked up from his documents. Mrs. Peterson, we've explained this to you already. The trust fund was established by your late mother for your daughter's inheritance. Harold was supposed to manage it until they turned 30, but instead, he's been systematically draining Beverly's portion to cover business expenses and family costs. The lawyer's words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Stephanie stared at him in horror, finally understanding the implications. You mean the money Dad's been giving me? The money I've been spending? Some of it was supposed to be Beverly's. According to the evidence, another lawyer said grimly, approximately $2.8 million of your sister's inheritance has been diverted to cover your credit cards, your apartment, your car payments, and various other expenses over the past decade. I watched Stephanie's face go through a range of emotions: shock, horror, guilt, and then desperate denial. But that's impossible, she said, her voice rising to near hysteria. Beverly got her inheritance. She got what Grandpa left her. She got that $1 and those personal items. Stephanie, I said quietly, and something in my tone made everyone in the room turn to look at me. There's something I need to tell all of you. The room fell completely silent, except for the continued ringing of phones that no one was answering anymore. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder containing copies of the most damning evidence from Grandpa's box. Grandpa didn't leave me $1 because he was disappointed in me. I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. He left me $1 because he knew Dad had already stolen my real inheritance, and he wanted me to have the evidence to get it back. I opened the folder and spread photographs of bank statements across the coffee table. These show exactly where my trust fund money went, Dad. Every transfer, every payment, every single dollar you stole from me over the past 10 years. Mom's face went white as she stared at the documents. I don't understand, she whispered. How do you have these? Grandpa spent the last 5 years of his life investigating Dad's embezzlement. I continued pulling out more evidence. He hired private investigators, forensic accountants, and lawyers to document everything. He knew that if he confronted Dad directly, the money would disappear and the evidence would be destroyed. So he waited until he was gone to let me handle it. Stephanie grabbed one of the bank statements, her hands shaking as she read it. This shows Dad paying my credit card bill with money from something called the Beverly Peterson Trust Fund, she said, her voice breaking. Oh my God, Beverly, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. But Dad knew, I said, looking directly at him for the first time since entering the room. And Mom, you knew too. You've been living off stolen money for a decade while making me feel guilty for not being as successful as my sister. One of the lawyers cleared his throat. Mrs. Peterson, if you have additional evidence beyond what the prosecutors already have, you need to turn it over to the authorities immediately. I smiled, and I knew it wasn't a particularly nice smile. Oh, I already have. My lawyers filed criminal charges and a civil lawsuit this morning. That's why Dad was arrested. The evidence Grandpa collected was so comprehensive that the district attorney says it's one of the strongest embezzlement cases they've ever seen. The room erupted in chaos. Mom started crying uncontrollably. Stephanie began screaming questions at me that I couldn't answer fast enough. And the family lawyers started frantically making phone calls. But through it all, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in years. Beverly, Mom said through her tears, surely we can work this out as a family. Your father made some mistakes, but we can pay the money back. You don't need to destroy our lives over this. I looked at her with amazement. Even now, even caught red-handed with undeniable evidence of their crimes, she was trying to minimize what they'd done and manipulate me into backing down. Mom, I said, my voice steady and clear. Dad didn't make mistakes. He committed felonies. For 10 years he stole from me while you both laughed at my modest lifestyle and made me feel like a failure. You spent my inheritance while telling me I didn't measure up to your standards. I stood up, gathering my evidence back into the folder. Grandpa left me one thing that you can never steal, never diminish, and never take away my dignity. And now I'm going to use it. As I walked toward the door, I heard Mom calling after me, begging me to reconsider, promising things would be different. But I didn't turn around. I had a new life to build, and it was going to be everything Grandpa had hoped for me. 6 months later, I stood in the cemetery where Grandpa was buried, holding a bouquet of the wildflowers he'd always loved. The legal battles were over, the money had been recovered, and my family's world had been completely transformed. But more importantly so had mine. The criminal trial had been swift and decisive. With the overwhelming evidence Grandpa had collected, Dad had no choice but to plead guilty to multiple felony charges. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution plus penalties, which totaled just over $7 million. The judge had been particularly harsh in his sentencing, noting that Dad had violated not just the law, but the sacred trust of family responsibility. The civil lawsuit had been even more successful than Sterling had predicted. Because Dad had used my stolen money as collateral for several business deals that had been profitable, I was awarded a percentage of those profits as well. Combined with the original theft amount, interest, and penalties, the final settlement was $9.2 million. But the money was only part of the story. The real transformation had happened in how I saw myself and my place in the world. I'd left my teaching job not because I didn't love it anymore, but because I wanted to do something bigger with the resources I now had. Using a portion of my settlement, I'd established the William Peterson Foundation for Educational Excellence, providing scholarships and support for children from low-income families who showed exceptional academic promise. I'd also bought a beautiful house in the countryside, not because I needed to show off my wealth, but because I wanted space for the foster children I was now licensed to care for. 3 kids currently called my house home: Marcus, age 8, whose parents had died in a car accident; Sophia, age 10, who'd been removed from an abusive situation; and David, age 12, who'd aged out of several previous placements and had given up hope of finding a permanent family. The work was challenging, but infinitely rewarding. These children understood what it felt like to be overlooked, undervalued, and written off by the adults who were supposed to protect them. I could give them something I'd never had: unconditional love and support from someone who truly understood their struggles. Stephanie had been devastated by the scandal, but in an unexpected twist, it had actually been good for her in the long run. With her trust fund frozen and her credit cards canceled, she'd been forced to get a real job for the first time in her life. She was now working as a junior associate at a marketing firm, living in a modest apartment, and slowly learning how to be self-sufficient. We'd had several conversations over the past few months, and while our relationship would never be close, she'd finally begun to understand the damage our parents' favoritism had done to both of us. "I never realized how much pressure I was under to be perfect all the time," she'd told me during our last conversation. "And I never understood how lonely you must have felt being ignored while I got all the attention. I'm sorry, Beverly. I should have been a better sister." Mom had filed for divorce and moved to Florida to live with her sister while the scandal died down. She'd sent me a few letters apologizing for her behavior, but I wasn't ready to forgive her yet. Maybe someday we'd be able to have a relationship based on honesty rather than manipulation, but that day hadn't come yet. The most surprising development had been my relationship with Martin Thompson, Grandpa's original lawyer. He'd confided in me that carrying out Grandpa's deception had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done professionally. "Your grandfather made me promise not to give you any hints about what was really happening," he'd told me. "But watching your family treat you so cruelly that day was almost unbearable." Thompson had become a valuable advisor as I'd navigated my new financial situation, and he'd helped me establish the foundation and manage my investments responsibly. More importantly, he'd shared countless stories about Grandpa's life that I'd never heard before, helping me understand just how carefully planned my inheritance had really been. "Your grandfather started planning this the day your father was first appointed as executor of your grandmother's trust," Thompson had explained. "He suspected Harold was unreliable with money, but he wanted to give him a chance to prove himself. When the embezzlement started, William was heartbroken but not surprised. That's when he began documenting everything and planning your vindication. Standing there in the cemetery, I thought about all the ways my life had changed since that terrible morning in the lawyer's office. I was financially secure beyond my wildest dreams, but more importantly, I was finally living a life that had purpose and meaning. I was helping children who needed advocates, supporting educational opportunities for kids who reminded me of myself, and building the kind of legacy that would have made Grandpa proud. "Thank you," I said aloud to his gravestone, placing the wildflowers on the granite marker. "Thank you for seeing who I really was when no one else could. Thank you for teaching me that the greatest wealth is living with integrity. And thank you for showing me that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person you were meant to be." A gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees surrounding the cemetery, and for just a moment I could swear I heard Grandpa's voice saying what he'd told me so many times during our fishing trips. "Character, Beverly. Everything else is just noise, but character lasts forever." I walked back to my car with a lightness in my step that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with finally understanding my worth. I had 3 kids waiting at home for help with their homework, a foundation board meeting tomorrow morning, and a life full of purpose ahead of me. Sometimes the smallest inheritance, one single dollar, carries the greatest treasure, the truth about who you really are and what you're truly worth. And that's a gift that no one can ever steal from you. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone underestimated you only to be proven completely wrong? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Please hit that like button if this story reminded you that justice sometimes takes time, but always finds a way. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories about family's betrayal and the power of never giving up on yourself. Share this video with anyone who needs to remember that their worth isn't determined by how others treat them, and thank you for taking this journey with me. Remember, the best chapters of your life might be the ones you write after everyone else has underestimated you. Until next time, keep believing in your own value no matter what anyone else says.